Hey everybody, and welcome to our session on Genesis 29. Last week we looked at Jacob in chapter 28 as he is heading out on his journey to Haran to find a bride, and the dream that he had with Jacob's, what we call Jacob's ladder, this ladder that went from heaven to earth, and how God spoke to him and passed on the covenant from Abraham and Isaac, and now he is has handed it on to Jacob once Isaac dies. So he this week is going to arrive in Padan Aram, and there is going to be much craziness that ensues once he gets there. So this is very similar to when we looked at Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for Isaac. Or the servant rather, went to Haran and he meets Rebekah at a well, and we see that Jacob is going to meet Rachel at a well. Both of them are going to have to deal with Laban. The contrast that we see, though, a couple of things. First of all is that the servant, once he finds Rebekah and decides that this is the one that the Lord has for Isaac, he returns very quickly to back to Canaan. Whereas with Jacob, he is going to find Rachel, but it is going to be a very long time before he is able to return back to his home in Canaan. And then the other thing is, we see with Abraham's servant that he was spending time in prayer as he was looking for his bride. But with Jacob, we're not seeing that time in prayer as he approaches the well and is looking for this wife. So as we look into verses 1 through 3 of chapter 29, it is pretty straightforward. It says that Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the East. And this word for people of the East, or the Easterners, is essentially anyone who lived east of Canaan or east of the Jordan River. And as he looked, he saw a well in a field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. So Jacob arrives at this land which is east. It is east of Canaan, it's east of the Jordan River, and of course we know this is where Abraham's family came from, it's where his mother Rebekah came from. But one of the things that we have talked about in previous sessions of the study is that anytime someone is moving east, they are moving away from God. This is a depiction of moving away from God. So like when Adam and Eve moved from the Garden of Eden, or left the Garden of Eden, they were going east. After the flood, when the people began to redistribute and are headed towards this plain where they're going to build the Tower of Babel, it says they headed east. When Abraham and Lot separated and Lot moved to the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, he moved east. Now we see Jacob moving east, or going east to take a wife. Now it seems like he is in God's plan in doing this. We don't want a wife from the Canaanites, but what we can know is that even though Jacob has gone east to find a wife and to get a wife from his mother's family, that God did not want him to stay there. He has already told him in the previous chapter, you're going to go here, you're going to find a wife, but then you are going to return home. I'm going to see to it that you come back to the promised land. So the reference here too could be that Rebekah's family and Abraham's family were idol worshipers. So he's not going, and we're going to see idols come into play in just a couple of chapters. So he doesn't want Jacob to stay with these idol worshipers. He wants him to go back to the land of Canaan once he finds a wife. He doesn't want him to permanently move east. So when he arrives, the first thing he sees is this well, and it's a covered well to water the flocks out in the fields nearby. And if you kind of note the process for watering the sheep, so when he arrives, it says 3 flocks of sheep, but they haven't uncovered the well yet, and they haven't watered their sheep yet. So in verse 4, it says that Jacob says to them, "My brothers, where do you come from? And they said, we are from Haran. He said, do you know Laban the son of Nahor? They said, we know him. And he said, is it well with him? They said, it is well. And here comes Rachel, his daughter, with Laban's flocks. So these are obviously multiple livestock owners. These are not all sheep from one owner. And Rachel is now coming with Laban's sheep. So he then says to them, it's still high day. It is not time for the livestock to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them. But they said, we cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep. So when Jacob encounters the shepherds here, he asks them where they're from. There's no signpost here to say you are entering Haran County or you're entering the city limits of Padan Aram. So probably from time to time, he's having to stop and check to see how close he's getting. And when he gets here, he finds out that these men are from Haran. And not only are they from Haran, but they know Laban. Not only do they know Laban, but look, here is his daughter coming with her sheep. You know, he knew that he was supposed to be going to Haran to find a wife from among Laban's daughters. And here's one coming before he even gets to Laban's house. So what is Jacob's response? Well, he tells the other guys, you need to water your sheep and you need to hit the road because I may want to get to know this girl. And the other shepherds answer him, we can't. Well, why can't they? Well, in the ancient Near East, shepherds would take their flocks out to graze, but they didn't have fences and boundaries like we do, where, you know, maybe you have a field of sheep, maybe you have a field of cows, a pasture with cows, but what we have land that we own and we send our animals out to graze on our own property. These people, they would mingle their flocks. The land was not particularly lush. It was kind of rocky, and the grass was more like sprigs of grass than big, you know, blanketed areas of grass. And so they would have to work out something where they could shepherd their flocks together, but where they could distribute the resources fairly that they had, because a lot of the resources were pretty scarce. And one of those resources was water, and water was life. And so they come to this well and they have to share the water in the well. And so what they would probably do is wait until all of the flocks in that area that are grazing in that area come to the well before they would remove the top, and then no one would be getting extra access to the water. And this, they literally would have formal legal agreements, herding contracts, that would aid them in making sure that all of their resources were distributed fairly and evenly. So these men are telling Jacob, we have to wait. We can't take the lid off the well just yet because all of the flocks haven't arrived. So Rachel arrives with her sheep, and Jacob takes one look at her, and he goes over and rolls the stone away. Now, we've already read that the stone was large, but it says that he moves it and then he waters his sheep. So this is a contrast again to when Abraham's servant came, because when Abraham's servant came, Rebekah was the one who watered his camels. Now we have Rachel coming, and when Rachel comes, Jacob is the one who waters her animals. And we've kind of talked about Jacob as seeming to be kind of like a mama's boy, but to realize that he can roll this stone away from this well would indicate that he was a very strong man. And what an impression he's making. He is being gallant by moving the stone and watering her animals. He is showing off his strength by moving the stone. And he is caring for the things that she is, you know, he's taking a load off of her, caring for the things that she's supposed to be caring for. So he's just doing all the things right here to impress Rachel. And then in verses 11 through 14, it says, then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. And as soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. And Jacob told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. So put yourself in Rachel's place here. You know, this strange man that you've never met has jumped up and taken care of your animals all of a sudden. And then he kisses you, which kisses in this culture were a form of greeting. So this was not like, you know, some big romantic kiss, but he kisses you and he starts to weep aloud. The kiss would have been normal, but the weeping, like, you know, this guy is taking care of her flocks and then he kisses her and then all of a sudden he's just sobbing and he tells her, I'm related to you. I would probably be thinking at this point that this guy has kind of lost his mind a little bit. You know, I mean, even though the kiss itself was a normal greeting, you know, the fact that he's just jumped up and started crying and taking care of her animals and all this kind of stuff, somehow it would just seem a little odd to me. Maybe it didn't to her, but it would to me. But you know, after everything that's happened, Jacob has walked 500 miles alone, not really knowing exactly where he's going. He was probably a little out of his mind with relief, just knowing that he's finally arrived and that things are already falling into place. And so he tells Rachel, I'm your family. And she goes and gets her father. And we see a somewhat similar response when Laban arrives. You know, they embrace and they kiss, but it doesn't say there's any weeping this time. So that, you know, he seems to have curtailed his emotions a little bit by the time that Laban arrives. And what does Laban say to Jacob? Well, he says to him here, you are my flesh and blood. And this is another term that has a little bit of a legalish meaning to it because it is adoption language. Jacob is his family, but this is a term that would be used towards someone that you're kind of adopting into your family or as a partner into your family business. So Laban may have been kind of proposing here that he is coming into some sort of a partnership relationship with Jacob. He's taking him into the family, and he might have even had prospects for an inheritance, depending on how the relationship played out. But this is a feeling that's not going to last very long. So as we get into verses 15 through 20, it says, then Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, and remember, he's been with him for a month already. We're not just still in the same conversation. So when Laban said to Jacob, because you are my kinsman, you should therefore serve me for nothing. Tell me, what shall be your wage? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. And Jacob loved Rachel. And he said, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than I should give her to any other man, so stay with me. And Jacob served for 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her. So, you know, this seems like such a romantic situation here. The last part of 14, as we said, Jacob has been with Laban for a month now. And in verse 15, he makes Jacob this offer. And on the surface, it kind of seems like this is a generous thing to do. You know, you're staying here, you're working, let me pay you. But in reality, Laban is letting Jacob know, first of all, you can't just hang out here indefinitely. Remember that Jacob was used to being kind of in charge. He was used to having servants. And we don't know exactly what his role was when he was at home, but Laban is kind of saying, you're going to have to work for a living. And in offering him a wage, he is turning him into a paid employee or a servant rather than a family member. So Laban is kind of recanting what he said in the former verse, letting Jacob know that he is not going to enjoy a share of the property as a family partner. And David Guzik had a great statement in his commentary that can be found online and related to Jacob and this situation. And he said, Jacob's reaction in this situation would reveal much of his character. This demonstrates the principle that you never know what kind of servant you will be until others treat you like a servant. And, what kind of servant are we? We talk about wanting to have a servant's heart, but what if somebody really treated us like you would treat a servant? It's one thing to say, I want to go out and feed the poor, and yet the poor are, you may be serving them in one way, but the poor would tend to be very appreciative and grateful for what you're doing. But what if they treated you as if you were their servant and kind of bossed you around, and you didn't have the status with them that you might enjoy otherwise? What if you were really treated like a servant? How would we react? Philippians 5:5-7 says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a servant and coming in the likeness of man. So here we have this picture of Jesus coming as a servant in order to give his life for us. And we know that he was not treated very well. But it says in Philippians that we're to let this mind be in us. We are supposed to think the way Christ did. We're supposed to have the mind of Christ. In Matthew 20:28, it says, the Son of Man, which is the name that Jesus used often for himself, did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So are we humble enough to take it and to respond like Christ when someone treats us like a servant? We don't see Jacob responding in any kind of anger or getting all out of sorts. It's almost as if he sees an opportunity here. In verse 16, it tells us Laban had 2 daughters. How are they described? Well, the first way they're described is Leah had weak eyes. That's all it really tells us about her. No one has ever really been able to agree on what exactly it means to say that Leah had weak eyes. It could have been a defect in the way she looked in her face, and this would have detracted from her overall appearance. Some commentators say that it could be translated tenderness, which would be a positive trait for Leah. But if that's the case, then what the writer here is saying is that Leah had this one positive trait, which was the tenderness in her eyes, and there was really nothing else good to say about her appearance. On the other hand, Rachel seemed to be beautiful. She had many beautiful traits. She had a beautiful figure. She had a beautiful face. And so comparing the 2 girls, the little sister is definitely the pretty sister. And Jacob, of course, has fallen in love with the first pretty face that he sees when he arrives in Haran. So he asks for her hand in marriage. Now, he's got no money that we know of. He left home with what he could carry on his back. As far as we know, he had no animals with him. He had no servants with him. And we don't know how much money he brought with him. But he agrees, he actually offers to work for 7 years because he doesn't have any money to pay the bride price for Rachel. So he says, I will work for you for 7 years and my wage will be your daughter. One of the things that we can also see about Jacob's response in verse 18, we talked about what his character would be and how he would respond to Laban when Laban is offering to pay him and is treating him like a servant. And in the ESV, which is what I generally study out of, Jacob's response is, I will serve. So what we can see is his character, and his reaction is that he is willing to serve for what he loves. So do we love enough to serve? Do we love other people enough to serve? Do we love the Lord enough to serve? We need to be able to love enough to serve. So Jacob then tells Laban that he will serve for an extended period of time. Now Jacob is heir to Isaac's fortune, but it isn't his yet. So he has to be able to pay for his part of the marriage contract. And just doing a little calculating based on what we believe bride prices from old documents, what bride prices would be back then and what average wages would be at that time. An average bride price would have been between 30 and 40 shekels of silver in the mid-second millennium. The work that Jacob was doing would pay about a shekel per month. So substituting 7 years of labor for the bride price would result in 84 shekels, or twice the going rate. So if the going rate was 40 shekels, then Jacob is saying, by working for you for 7 years, I'm going to pay you 84 shekels for your daughter. So Jacob is willing to pay double because he loved Rachel so much. And Laban knew that he kind of had Jacob over a barrel. He basically cheated him out of 3.5 years of work because Jacob had no leverage with which to bargain. And then verse 20 covers this entire 7 years. It says that he worked for 7 years for Laban, and it was just flew by because he loved Rachel so much, and he was just so willing to work for her. So in 21 through 25, stuff really starts hitting the fan. Because Jacob says to Laban, give me my wife so that I may go into her, for my time is completed. I'm sure he is marking the days on whatever they had that served as a calendar. And Laban gathered together all of the people of the place and made a feast. But in the evening, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave her also a female servant, Zilpah, for Leah to be her servant. And in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And Jacob said to him, what is this you have done to me? Did I not serve you for Rachel? How then have you deceived me? So remember here that a betrothed woman has the same status as a wife. So when he goes to Laban and says, give me my wife, he's basically saying, I paid you the bride price for Rachel. She is my wife, so you need to give her to me. This is not just a law that is set forth in the Bible, although it is made very clear in Deuteronomy 20 and 22 that a betrothed woman has this status as a wife. But also in the ancient Near East and some of their other laws, such as the Code of Hammurabi, what we see are civil laws that say the same thing. So this was pretty much a cultural norm for them. And he says, I want to go into her. So basically he's saying, I've waited long enough. I want to make love to my wife, because that was a privilege that the betrothed did not have. So in verse 22 then, Laban throws a party. In this culture, marriage was a very joyful celebration. It was considered to be a business transaction between two families. They did not have a ceremony like we do. They just kind of partied, and then but the agreement would be made sometimes several years earlier, and years might pass, as we have seen here, and then the couple would come together. And so they have this big feast, and the marriage itself was culminated in the act of the consummation. So this would occur usually somewhere within the bride's family compound. They might set up a tent They might have a chamber in the house where this would take place, but it would happen within the bride's family house area. Sometimes brides would continue to live with their families, with the husband just coming to make conjugal visits, basically, until she conceived a child. And then once she conceived a child, this would kind of be the signal that it was time for her to go live with her husband. So they're having this feast. Evening comes, and Laban takes Leah to Jacob instead of Rachel, and he makes love to her. Why didn't he know that it wasn't Rachel? Well, the wedding customs of the day, first of all, would require that the wife wear a veil. She would be veiled from head to toe during the entire feasting, celebration, all of that, until she was in the bedroom. The scripture tells us that it was evening, so it's likely that wherever they were, whatever chamber they were in, that it was dark. And I'm sure that Laban probably facilitated that. Jacob's probably had a little bit to drink, so he might have been a little on the drunk side. And men and women in this culture didn't spend a lot of time together. Definitely not romantic time together. So Jacob would have never held her hand other than this kiss of greeting at the well. He never kissed her. And so he didn't know what she felt like. He didn't know all those little nuances. And so he gets into this dark chamber, and Leah may not have even taken her veil off until after the deed was done. I mean, we have no idea. But it is very probable. It could have, obviously, it was easily done for him not to recognize that he was with the wrong woman until it was too late. So we don't know if Leah was in any kind of agreement with this, but what we do know is that Laban, as the father, would have had absolute authority in the family home, and he could have forced her to do this, and probably did force her to do it, because even if she was not a pretty woman and didn't have a lot of other prospects, I mean, what woman wants to be the surprise in the morning when your man thinks that he's been with somebody else? I can't think of many women who would want to be in that position. So in verse 25, Jacob wakes up and, he is not a happy camper. So what is his question then to Laban in this verse? Well, he asked him several, but the last one that he asked is, why have you deceived me? And how ironic is that? The deceiver has been deceived. And in truth, there is so much irony to this marriage and to this whole situation that it is almost kind of unbelievable. So some of the things that we can see here is, first of all, Jacob had probably been told all of his life by his mother that the younger would serve the older. So he probably grew up believing that it was Esau's place to serve him. And now he is being made to serve Laban. So he is in the position that he feels Esau should be in for him. The second thing we see is that by being given Leah first, Jacob is learning that the right of the firstborn has to be respected. Jacob deceived his father, and he is now deceived by Rachel's father. Jacob deceived his father in Esau's clothes, and now he's being deceived by Leah in Rachel's clothes. And these may not have actually been Rachel's clothes, but it was the bridal garb, and Rachel was supposed to be in it, not Leah. And then lastly, Jacob exchanged the younger for the older, and Laban exchanged the older for the younger. So God had promised Jacob the covenant through his mother before Jacob was even born. He didn't have to cheat for it, but he did. God didn't take the promise away from him. Instead, he used the consequences of Jacob's actions to discipline him. And in the same way, our disobedience may not alter God's plan for us, but it may change the way we experience God's plan for us. we may end up dealing with the consequences of what we've done for a long time while God teaches us a very hard lesson. Just because Laban is being used as an instrument of discipline, though, does not mean that it excuses his actions any more than it excused Jacob's actions, because he had already been promised the birthright. So in verses 26 through 30, then we have Laban's response, and he says, "It is not done so in our country." Basically, he's saying this is not the custom here, to give the younger before the firstborn. Complete the week of this one, and we will give you the other also in return for serving me another 7 years. So Jacob did so, and he completed her week. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. And Laban gave his female servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her servant. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. And he served Laban for another 7 years. So Laban's response is, "It's not our custom." Now, there's nothing in any of the documents from this time period that indicate whether this was really a custom or not. But, if we go back to the Code of Hammurabi, which was a legal document, a set of laws that was applicable in this culture, in this time frame, there was a law that stipulated that there was a penalty for failing to produce the bride that a bride price had been paid for. So basically what Laban has done is what we would consider to be breach of contract. And his excuse was, well, this is not our custom. Maybe he's afraid that he's not going to be able to marry Leah off unless he tricks somebody into doing it. We just don't know. But again, Jacob finds himself between a rock and a hard place because he has no other option than to comply. So the trickster is getting tricked. So Laban makes him an offer, and this offer is give Leah her week, and then you can have Rachel, but you got to work for another 7 years. So based on those calculations that we did earlier, Jacob really has already paid enough for both women. But Laban kind of has him where he wants him, and Jacob agrees. So he finishes out this first week, which was, again, a customary thing. The wedding basically lasted a week. So he gives Leah her week, and then he gets Rachel. And he also gets female servants that come with both women. But in verse 30, we see a statement about Jacob's relationship with his 2 wives. He was partial. And you would think that he would have learned a lesson about partiality from his parents, because they were each partial to one of their children. And they each treated their children differently, and it created a lot of problems in the home. But he continues the trend of partiality, and he favors Rachel over Leah. And then later what we will see once his children come along is that he extends that partiality to some of his children as well. So let's just kind of finish up the chapter here by looking at the birth of his first few children, and then we're going to talk about Leah at the end here. Verse 31 to me is such a sad verse, and yet it's a touching one as well, because it says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." And I think it depicts for us the tenderness with which God sees us. Leah was not a perfect person by any stretch, and we're going to see that as the chapters and the story progresses. But God sees that she's not loved by her husband, and as we will continue to see, she was mistreated by her sister, and she's in a mess that is not of her own making. So God gives her children ahead of her sister. He was good to Leah even when other people were not. So let's look at these 4 children, and then we're going to look, like I said, at Leah. The first child's name was Reuben. The first child was a boy, and she named him Reuben, which means, look, a son. So basically, it's a boy. But she also said, the look portion of it is because she said the Lord had seen or had looked upon her affliction and responded by giving her a son. So being the first son, then, Reuben would be the logical one to inherit the covenantal promise, to inherit the birthright and the blessing that's been passed down from Abraham. But what we are going to see as we continue to study on through the book is that this is not going to happen. So once again, we are going to have an eldest child who does not receive the rights of the firstborn. And then Leah makes this really heartbreaking statement here because she says, now maybe my husband will love me. You know, I've given him a child, maybe he will love me. And how used she must feel knowing that Jacob is willing to sleep with her, but he doesn't love her. So the next child we come to then is Simeon. And Simeon's name means hearing, because she says the Lord has heard that she was unloved. So he saw that she was unloved. Now he has heard that she is unloved. Her hopes for Reuben's birth did not have the desired effect. Jacob has obviously not turned to her in love, although he is still willing to have sex with her. And because of that, she gets pregnant and has a third son. And his name is Levi. And Levi means attachment. And she named him this because of the hope that having a third son for her husband would cause him to become attached to her. Through all of the births of these children, Leah is seeking fulfillment and satisfaction from her husband. She's hoping to have this loving relationship with Jacob, and unfortunately, it is just not forthcoming. But in truth, she is really looking for this satisfaction and this fulfillment in the wrong place. So she gets pregnant again, and she has a fourth son, and his name is Judah. Several years obviously have passed by because she's had 4 children now. By now, she changes her tactic in naming him. This child is not named for her pain. Instead, he is named Praise because she says now she will praise the Lord. So I don't know if Leah knew that there was something different about this child and what would come from him as opposed to her other children. We'll never know. But for whatever reason, with this child, her focus changes from Jacob to God. So let's look at Leah for a minute and take a long look at 2 of these boys. Leah's story really seems to be kind of a sad one. She is often overshadowed by the story of Jacob and Rachel, but she has an incredible place in history, not only as it regards the nation of Israel, but within the story of the gospel. Because what we see in upcoming chapters is that her place in the home and her relationship with her sister did not make life pleasant for her. So she must have doted on these children. But even though she didn't really do anything of any major noteworthy achievement other than having children, it is worthy to note that 6 of the sons that she gave birth to would become half of the tribes of Israel. One of those tribes would become the priestly tribe. And as we would move on through the Torah and we would begin to look at the law in Deuteronomy and the establishment of the tabernacle and all of those, their worship would become more formalized, what we would see is that all of the priests would come from this tribe of Levi. So her third son became the priestly tribe. Her fourth son, Judah, would become the royal tribe. And it would be through this tribe of Judah that the Messiah would come. It was not through the line of the loved, beautiful wife, but it was through the plain, unloved sister. Leah also was honored more in her death than Rachel was. Rachel, we know, died in childbirth, and was buried in near the place where she died. Leah, however, was buried in the cave at Mamre, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah would be buried. And what we know is in chapter 49, as Jacob is giving his final instructions to his sons, he tells them that when he dies, he wants them, if they ever leave Egypt and get back to the promised land, he wants them to take his bones and bury them in the cave at Mamre with all of his ancestors. And then he says, and there I buried Leah. So in the long run, he would be buried with Leah, again, not with Rachel, the loved, beautiful wife. So even though Leah was the least preferred, she was the chosen instrument of God that was used to bring about the Messiah. I think this is a wonderful lesson to us, especially as women, because so often we can feel unloved or overlooked. We can feel inadequate. We can feel like a situation that we're in our life is just an unending trial. But when we feel unloved, we can know that God loves us. He sees our pain. He hears how we feel. And he can still use us in an incredible way. Matthew 19:30, and in corresponding passages in the two other synoptic gospels, Jesus is recorded to say, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And I think this is the principle that we see lived out in Leah. We'll see you next week.